virtual space. If you're already here, welcome. It's nice to have you. All right, we will go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone out there. I'm Julia, a bookseller with Politics and Prose. We're live with Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein discussing Nudge, the final edition. You can follow the link we'll post in the chat to purchase your copy directly from us at Politics and Prose. If you have a question for our speakers this evening, feel free to put that in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll move to questions throughout the discussion. So as you think of them, make sure you log them there. And we apologize in advance if we run short on time for all of them. And we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service as well. If you'd like to enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. We do want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We are very grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. Now let's talk about the book. Since the original publication of Nudge more than a decade ago, the title has entered the vocabulary of business people, policymakers, engaged citizens, and consumers everywhere. The book has given rise to more than 400 nudge units in governments around the world and countless groups of behavioral scientists in every part of the economy. It has taught us how to use thoughtful choice architecture, a concept the authors invented, to help make better decisions for ourselves, our families, and our society. Now, Thaler and Sunstein have rewritten the book from cover to cover, making use of their experiences in and out of government over the past dozen years, as well as an explosion of new research in numerous academic disciplines. To commit themselves to never undertaking this daunting task again, they are calling this the final edition. It offers a wealth of new insights for both its avowed fans and newcomers to the field about a wide variety of issues that we face in our daily lives. That is health, personal finance, retirement savings, credit card debt, home mortgages, medical care, organ donation, climate change, and sludge. More on sludge later. All while honoring one of the cardinal rules of nudging, make it fun. Here with us is Richard Thaler, who is awarded the 2017 Nobel Prize in Economics. He is the Charles R. Walgreen Distinguished Service Professor of Behavioral Science and Economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and a member of the National Academy of Science and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2015, he was the president of the American Economic Association and has been published in numerous prominent journals, and is the author of Misbehaving, the Making of Behavioral Economics. And Cass Sunstein is the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard Law, where he is the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy. He served as administrator to the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Obama administration, and as chair of the Technical Advisory Group for Behavioral Insights and Health at the World Health Organization. His many books include titles like Impeachment, A Citizen's Guide, Too Much Information, and his most recent collaboration, Noise. He is the recipient of the 2018 Hallberg Prize, awarded annually to a scholar who has made outstanding contributions to research in the arts, humanities, social sciences, law, or theology. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. Thank you both so much for being here.
We're happy to be here.
We could say so much about the two of your incredible careers. So thanks again for joining us for this great conversation about the final edition of Nudge. We did just mention in the green room that I first came to Nudge, the first version that you published in 2008. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was very nervous, as were we all. I was turning to really close friends, wondering about, will the center hold? All these systems were collapsing, or to me, they appeared to be collapsing. And I was just really looking for anything that would sort of give me ideas on how public systems or everything around us could not control us and mandate all of our choices, but help us to act in our best interests as a society. And my friend said, well, have you read Nudge? And so I first read the 2008 edition back at the beginning of 2020. So thank you both for that. So that sort of prompts me to ask here at the top of our discussion, both for people who are new or for people who are returning for the revised edition, what prompted the first publication back in 2008? How did the two of you meet? And how did you come together to collaborate on the initial publication? And then why, after nearly a decade, did you want to return to it and revise it and create the final edition?
Maybe I can start with the meeting and then Dick can talk about the latest chapter. So I started at the University of Chicago Law School, where the prayer we said in the morning was, human beings are rational. They respond to incentives. Amen. And there were many great people who taught me that prayer, and I tried to say it, but I didn't quite believe it. I was a literature major, and I thought, people aren't always rational and they don't always respond to incentives. But I was kind of a clueless skeptic. That is, I didn't have tools by which to combat my brilliant and awesome colleagues. One of those brilliant and awesome colleagues said, when I was struggling and trying to write papers about how people weren't perfectly rational, that there's someone who has actually published some excellent, though completely misguided work on this topic, and his name is Thaler. And he said it with a kind of admiration mixed with disgust. And I thought, okay, I should read Thaler. And then I read an early paper of Dick's, and I thought it was phenomenal and eye-opening, because it actually gave a framework for thinking about human behavior that wasn't just literature, which is a little amazing, of course, but all over the place. It was disciplined. So when Dick came to the University of Chicago, I thought this would be a very good person to get to know. And we had lunch and had a great friendship almost immediately. And we worked on a paper that was on something called the behavioral approach to law and economics. Have you fallen asleep yet? We ended with a discussion of paternalism, and we called it the section anti-paternalism. Now that's confusing and horrible. It doesn't even have an obvious meaning. And then a few years later, Dick had an idea called libertarian paternalism. And he floated it over one of our frequent lunches. And I thought that was great. And we produced a paper on that. And then eventually that became Nudge. Nudge is a better title, isn't it? The libertarian paternalism.
Definitely. Yeah, I feel like you do go at lengths to make sure that your audience understands what you mean by libertarian paternalism. Can you, for those of us who may be new to the idea, why did you land on the title Nudge, and what does that sort of refer to with the title?
So yeah, maybe let me just flesh out Kaz's story slightly. And he mentioned I had come up with this phrase, and the way it happened was I was giving a talk at the University of Chicago on a paper that I had written with a former student of mine about save more tomorrow, a concept we talk about in the book. And the idea was to invite people to agree to commit themselves to saving more each year. And the basis was we all have more self-control in the future. So we're all thinking of dieting next month or maybe later. And so we had this idea, and it worked amazingly well when we finally got a company to try it. And I was presenting these results to a very Chicago audience. And my discussant, if you're not an academic and you're unfamiliar with this is a person that's designated to trash the previous presentation. And this person actually served in the previous administration, to give you a sense of his meanings. And he said at the end, well, yeah, I guess this works, but isn't this paternalism? And, in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, maybe calling somebody a communist or a Packers fan could be worse than paternalist, but those are probably the only things. And I was taken aback because this idea was opt-in. And I said, well, normally we think of paternalism as coercion, and there's no coercion here. So I don't know, maybe it's a different kind of paternalism. I don't know, maybe we could call it libertarian paternalism. And I hated that. And so that's when the next day at my weekly lunch with Cass, I said, oh, Cass, I have a phrase people will really hate. And that obviously led to a book. As to the title Nudge, publishers didn't really like this book. And one of the many publishers that rejected it said, we would really like to publish this, but we're in a bit of a mess right now. But, the concept makes me think of this word nudge, which is sort of fun. Maybe that would be a good title. And we seized on that and wrote the entire book using that idea to make sure that our new publisher wouldn't be tempted to change it. And that worked.
And we're very glad that it did. The book, of course, really has done phenomenally well. It's the word choices you use, it's become a common part of many economists' vocabularies. So now, could you speak to why revise? Why now? What's the new conversation that happened between you?
So the story of how we came to do this, we were in fact nudged, and the way we were nudged was somebody at our original publisher noticed that our contract with Penguin Random House now, that for the paperback had expired about 18 months ago, and we probably should have a new one. And they suggested maybe we could offer up a new chapter or something to sweeten the deal. And this was April 2020. And we all remember April 2020. Once you had streamed Tiger King, there really wasn't anything else to do. And you were so desperate, you were reading the original version of Nudge. And we started doing that too. And we found it a bit old. There was a reference to the iPod, remember those? And how spiffy it was. And so we started fiddling with it. And then we kind of fell for the while we're at it bias and got carried away. We've talked to various people in the book business, and maybe you have a view about this, but no one can think of an example of any authors as dumb as us to take a successful book that is still selling 3,000 or 4,000 copies a month and completely rewrite it. What, Cass could have written 5 books in the time that it took us to do this revision. But once we got started, we were having fun with it. And I insisted on a rule that the only things we would include were things that would be fun for us to write, and we hope fun for the readers to read. And that's what we did during our pandemic months.
And we're very glad that you did. But before we touch on some of the additions and some of the revised content, both myself and some of our audience members would like to know if you could sort of, and of course everyone should get the book, definitely. But if you could talk about what are
required.
sort of, it's required reading. If you could talk about some of the core principles, maybe the concept of choice architecture, and we already talked about a little bit the human versus econ that you talk about in the beginning of the book. If you could talk about sort of the core of the original publication as a launching off point. After that,
Okay, so let's talk about humanity, shall we? Our species, we now know something about, that our judgments about risk aren't perfect. We might be really scared of things that aren't dangerous and really complacent about things that quite are dangerous. And there are mental shortcuts we use to assess risk that can be pretty good, but can get us in big trouble. Human beings tend to focus on today and tomorrow. The future is a foreign country, later land, and we're not always sure we're going to visit. It's called present bias. Inertia is a very powerful force. The first edition of the book had one new heuristic. A heuristic is a mental shortcut, one that is invented in the book. It's called the yeah, whatever heuristic, which means when people are confronted with a situation, they often say, yeah, whatever, whether it's a rental car agreement or something from health insurance or a deductible in an insurance plan or a relationship to your employer. If you're active or interested or not busy, you might fight and struggle and try to read the small print, but often people say, yeah, whatever. Now, this amazing species that is humanity often makes really good decisions, but sometimes these things, present bias, unrealistic optimism, procrastination, inertia, poor risk perception, can lead us into big trouble. So that's a focus of the early part of the book is on, let's say, our departures from perfect rationality. Now, choice architecture is both an opportunity and a problem. If you go into a grocery store, there's a choice architecture. It may be that cereals that are loaded with sugar are right there as soon as you go in the first aisle. Or it might be that carrots and lettuce are in the first aisle. And that will actually likely affect people's choices. If you go on a website and there's something that's listed first and in big font, that will often attract the eye. And if there's something small and kind of in the middle and hidden, it might be a fee, it might be a term of an agreement, it might be something that you bind yourself to without really focusing on it. That is part of choice architecture. So whenever we go online, when we go in a building, when we go in a voting booth, there is a choice architecture, and little pieces of the choice architecture can often affect our choice. Sometimes for better, sometimes it can incline us to, get to our own preferred destination. Like a GPS device is a provider of a choice architecture, or it can be like a fiendish or satanic GPS device, which leads us, let's say, to unhealthy choices or to part with our hard-earned money.
I was even thinking along the lines of, because once you start thinking about it, you often can't stop. But even for our audience out there, to think about all of the choice architecture that they must have interacted with to lead them to this Zoom discussion tonight. Could you even think of some of the choice architecture they would have interacted with?
Well, a good example would be social media. So social media is a choice architecture engine. And whether you're on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, there's an algorithm that is deciding what things to show you. And depending on the social media network, there will be various rules about how that's organized. Instagram is very visual, so it's all about pictures. TikTok is yet another thing. You probably didn't get here via TikTok. It's more likely to be Twitter. And what captures your attention? The advertisers on Twitter are spending a lot of money trying to figure that out. And some people are just naturally good at it. And whatever drove you here, we're happy to see you. and hope to get to your questions. We're guessing that there are some readers of the old book that are here to see what we really look like and sound like, and maybe to find out what are the new things in this version of the book.
Exactly. And talking about social media and talking about the internet does sort of bring to one of the new concepts in the book, where you write a new chapter on sludge. So it's nice that it rhymes with nudge, but can you talk about what is sludge in this context, and why did you want to bring that into the revised edition?
So let me tell the story of the origin of sludge as a term. And it was when my book Misbehaving was published, and the first review came out in a London newspaper, and my editor sent me a link very excitedly. Oh, here's the first review of the book. And I get there and there's a paywall. I can't even see the first couple lines of it. And but there's a trial. You can get a trial subscription for just £1 for 30 days. I thought, okay, I'm willing to pay £1 to read a review, at least the first one. And but I said, they're going to get my credit card, and I know they'll automatically renew me. And we told stories in the original edition about Cass having some lifetime magazine subscriptions because he never got unsubscribed. So I wanted to see what it would take for me to quit. And I discovered that in order to quit, I would have to call London, not on a toll-free line, during London business hours, and I would have to give 14 days notice, making this a 2-week subscription. And so I told my editor, you subscribe. And I said, sludge, and talked about this on Twitter, and it became a bit of a meme. And of course, the fact that it rhymes with nudge was not a coincidence. But I think it may be the first scientific term that was ever the correct scientific reference is to Twitter. And it became a Twitter meme, and we got interested in it. And, you know, the unsubscribe trap, the fact that you can join with one click as long as you give your credit card, but unsubscribing maybe turn into Hotel California is one part of sludge. But there's another part that everything in the government, as Cass is an expert in, requires, and in the private sector, requires lots of forms to be filled out. And one of Cass's jobs back in the Obama administration and in his new job is to try and get rid of sludge. And Cass, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, so the United States, according to the last count, imposes over 195 billion hour. The Department of Homeland Security imposes more than 195 million hours in paperwork burdens on the American people, and the US government imposes many billions of hours in paperwork burdens on the American people. Those might be nurses and doctors who are trying to do their jobs. It might be poor people trying to get money to which they're entitled that would maybe help them to get a job or get educated. It might be people trying to get a permit or a license. So we're talking about billions and billions of hours in paperwork burdens. That's only the tip of the iceberg, really, because sludge can include waiting time. It can include interview requirements. It can include showing up to places that are far away, that are mandatory. And sometimes this form of sludge, that is frictions, administrative burdens of many kinds, it's like a wall between human beings and something that can change their lives. We've all experienced this, sometimes in a small way, when we're trying to cancel a subscription or get access to something, and it's a Stephen King novel that we find ourselves in when it should be simple. But in the immigration system, it may be someone who's trying to get help for a relative, or in the environmental system, it might be someone who's trying to do something actually good environmentally, who finds it very hard to navigate a process. So the war on sludge, that is a good war. It's an honorable war. And many bureaucrats have waged that war, but with inadequate success, in part because the idea of prioritizing removal of paperwork and administrative burdens seems a little technical and dry. But for the person who's old or sick, or maybe anxious, or suffering from heart disease, let's say, for that person, sludge can be either a literal killer, or if not quite that, then a metaphorical killer, because it kills a project that could make their lives a whole lot better.
And, special interests often have a proprietary interest in maintaining sludge. A friend of ours, Austin Goolsbee, who worked with Cass in the Obama administration, had an idea back in, I think, 2006. Why doesn't the IRS send people tax returns already filled in if they have a simple tax return? Now, in Sweden, you file your taxes by text message. You get a text message saying, we think we owe you 10,000 kroners. If you agree, press 1, and the money will appear in your bank account. Wouldn't that be nice? Well, thanks in part to the changes in the tax law that were passed in the Trump administration, 90% of American taxpayers would be eligible for this. Anyone who has a standard deduction, takes the standard deduction, the government knows how much you owe. They could just tell you. You wouldn't have to find all these pieces of paper and fill out all these forms. But there's actually a law that forbids the IRS from preparing a tax return for you. If you don't like that, call your congressperson.
There's seems to be quite a lot of sludge out there in the world. What are some of your best insights for our viewers in recognizing when they're dealing with sludge, and if it's a situation where they really just need to take a breath and interact with some of maybe that not so great choice architecture? What's an insight about how they can either make that system better as either a voter or a citizen, or not lose inertia and energy and steam sort of dealing with it?
One thing you can do is recognize the situation. So, let's go back to the origin story. Everybody should before you join anything, join a gym or subscribe to a news organization, find out what it will take to get out. If it's Hotel California, don't join. Let's teach people that if they're not going to let us quit easily, we're not going to join. And if everybody did that, the world would become a better place.
One thing we found since we've been talking about sludge is that in private institutions, it could even be a bookstore or a university, and in government institutions, the term sludge has caught on, so that employees might say, look, I'm spending a lot of my time doing paperwork and filling out forms. It's sludge. Can we cut that in half or eliminate it? And not infrequently, the answer is yes. And sometimes in state and local governments, the understanding that there's sludge out there makes people who maybe are low on the totem pole say to people who are a little bit higher, shouldn't we have a project of sludge reduction? And that question almost answers itself. The answer can never be no to the question, shouldn't we have a project of sludge reduction? Now, it might be that some forms of sludge are essential to make sure that the people who are seeking, let's say, a license deserve it. But if you look at what it's like to get a driver's license and get it renewed, it's a lot easier in some places than it is in others. And that's a really good thing. That's a kind of model for the others.
Lots of sludge introduced within organizations with good intentions. So there's someone at my university who decided that it was important to warn us if we receive an email from outside the university. Now, if you're a professor, 90%, much more than 90% of your email is from outside the university. But this guy decided to attach to every email from not the university a warning, caution, this comes from outside the university. As a result, your entire inbox on your phone, all you can see is caution, blah, blah, blah. And this would come in every message. So I took it upon myself to try to stop this. I failed, but at least I got the message shortened. And I continue to fight the good fight. I don't really need a message that this email from Cass is from outside the university or from Amazon or from the New York Times or from my favorite bookstore, right? I know that those emails are not from the University of Chicago. So organizations, if they just look inside and say, are we really, do we really need this? It can help a lot.
Mm-hmm. I did want to ask, because you talk about it in the book and some of our audience have questions as well. You talk extensively about default as a way to sort of cut through like the hard task of making decisions, and we're faced with a lot of choices. I wonder if you could talk about how you define default options and when they can sort of be benevolent and good choice architecture, or some that can be malignant, depending on where they're coming from.
Cass, why don't you answer this, because my light seems to have gone off, and I'll try. It's unlikely I can fix it, but I'll try.
Okay, that's a brilliant development, because lights can be on by default or they can turn off automatically after a certain point. In fact, we orchestrated this in order to give a real-time illustration of the power of defaults. So let's talk about lights, shall we?
Yes.
There are some lights where if you leave the room, they turn off automatically. That is dark by default, call it. And they're motion detectors. And that is a way of reducing energy use, saving money, and protecting the environment. Let's talk a little bit about the environment, shall we?
Yes.
In Germany and Switzerland, there's a policy initiative by which people are automatically enrolled in relatively greener energy sources, like solar and wind. In Switzerland, at least, those energy sources are slightly more expensive. So people are told by default, you're in green energy. Do you want to opt out? You can. It's easy. It turns out that the vast majority of people, including businesses, stay in the mildly more expensive but environmentally better energy source. There are kind of two reasons for that. One is inertia, that the default often sticks because people are busy and focused on other things. And the other is there's a kind of signal. If you're automatically enrolled in green energy, you might think that's what people think you should do, and you feel a little creepy opting out. So there's the light working. We've overcome the default of darkness, and that's working. I'll give you an example from the United States, which is the one government program, the one nudge, that it's hard for me to talk about because I start to cry. It's the only one that makes me tear up, and I'm going to try to avoid crying. And there's a program in the United States which gives poor kids a right to free breakfast and lunches. It's not a very controversial program. I mean, some of the details are, but the basic idea, if you're really poor, you get free school meals. That's agreed to. But for a long time, a lot of those kids didn't get the free school meals. Why? Because their parents didn't sign them up. So the default was you're not in. You have to do something to overcome the default. What do? We could have had an educational campaign. We could have said, don't you want your kids to sign up? We could have simplified the form. The policy that Congress adopted instead was to authorize our Department of Agriculture to do something called direct certification, where if the locality or the school knows the kid is poor, then by default, they're in the program. It's automatic. They're automatically in the program. And as a result of that program, about 15 million kids of all colors, all different kinds, 15 million poor kids are enjoying free, nutritious meals, lunch and breakfast. 15 million is a number. If we put, I think, the faces of, let's say, 8 of those kids on the screen right now, there might not be a dry eye in the house. And all that program does is to switch the default from you have to opt in to if you want to, you can opt out. Not a lot of people are opting out.
That's amazing. You did mention a little, you did touch with the conversation about default a little bit on the environment. You have written a lot of new content on the environment. And so if you would let our viewers know, how can individuals, and we might be talking about more companies, or even governments, be nudged to reduce climate change, global warming, and greenhouse gas emissions, as you talk about in the book?
So Cass is the environmental expert, and so I'll let him elaborate on that, and I'll play my role as the house economist and say what we say in the book is that climate change is a big problem, an existential problem for the planet. And the first step must be to get prices right. And we can nudge our little hearts out, and lots of nudges can help, like the nudge that somebody put that turned that light off automatically after a certain period of time. But we have to have a carbon tax. And oddly, even environmentalists don't seem to love carbon taxes. 100% of economists agree on this. There's a poll that the University of Chicago runs that asks economists across the spectrum a bunch of questions. You ask a question about the carbon tax, 100% agree that we should do it, that we have to start with that. But we can nudge as well. And something that we stress in this book is nudges can help every problem, but they can't solve every problem. And climate change is one. So let Cass talk about some of the successful nudges that do help. And as his former boss liked to say, better is good. So we like each positive change, but we have to start by getting the prices right.
So a big goal in the first edition was to expand the toolbox. So we often think about policies, allow or prohibit. That's a pretty limited toolbox. Sometimes we think, well, we can subsidize or we can tax, as well as allow or prohibit. We urge we can also nudge, that you can provide information, you can offer reminders, you can warn, you can tell people about social norms, you can use the architecture, you can change from opt-in to opt-out. Okay, in the domain of climate change, the tools are numerous. A carbon tax has widespread support among specialists. It doesn't have widespread support among populations in many countries. If we don't have a carbon tax, what can we do? Taking Dick's point, which President Obama used to say a lot, still does, which is better is good, you can inform people. So if you buy a car in the United States, you get a little label on it, which tells you something about greenhouse gases and also something about the annual fuel savings or costs compared to the average car. So we know we're being nudged to purchase a car that's more fuel efficient because we'll save money and it's environmentally better. That has an effect. We could be in every domain in which there is a choice that bears on climate change, informed of the impact in a way that could affect what we actually do. Architecture can also be used. So automatic turning off of lights is a way of using architecture to put people in the dark when it's not working so great, or to put empty rooms in the dark when it's working a little bit better. Or we can use, as California is doing, as well as some other nations, automatic enrollment in green energy. And the data from Switzerland is spectacular, where automatic enrollment in green energy has significantly reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and the benefits of that reduction in terms of climate and health benefits crush the costs. So on cost benefit grounds, it's a big winner. We've had an announcement within the last, I think, 2 or 3 hours by which the Biden administration, in which I am honored to serve, though I'm speaking now as an author, not as a bureaucrat, but the Biden administration has announced fuel economy standards that are going to make our automobiles much more fuel efficient. And the benefit of that, if it's working well, is that it's going to decrease greenhouse gas emissions very significantly. That's a standard economic point, but also save consumers a lot of money. And the rules of this kind that talk about the benefits of fuel efficient cars that stress consumer savings make an assortment of behavioral economics points about consumer choice and how they're not completely perfect. So when you're buying a car, you might think, how much does it cost today? And not so much, much is it going to cost over the next 5 years? And if you can get a car that's going to give you, let's say, $900 in net benefits over the course of 3 years, that's a good thing, even putting to one side the fact that it's going to be better for the planet.
Thank you both for that. Richard, I'm so struck by, from the economist's perspective, that there does seem to be a lot of attachment to messaging, but we run in fear or are allergic to numbers when it comes to climate change. But that is some of our work in addressing what is a preeminent issue that we will all be dealing with in perpetuity. Before we move on to some of these great audience questions, I was struck by hearing about the children's school lunches. I'm curious, are there any other nudge units that have been created, or are there particularly clever nudges that you've heard over the past decade from different places, from people coming up with their own that are very near and dear to you? Anything on social media or that you're particularly attached to?
There are a lot. So the United Kingdom, with Dick's help, created a behavioral insights team, which is now doing business in dozens of nations. One little thing they did that I'm very impressed by is that if we learn that we are deviating from the social norm, that we're drinking a lot more or smoking a lot more than most people like us, a lot of people start to think, well, maybe I shouldn't do that. They tried to reduce antibiotic prescriptions among doctors in the United Kingdom, and they told the doctors who were prescribing more antibiotics than the average by far that they were doing that. They just informed them, you're in the upper echelon of antibiotic prescribers. And that's not like winning the Olympic gold. That's like kind of a problem. And the doctors responded to that by reducing by, I believe, tens of thousands over a relatively short period, the number of antibiotic prescriptions. I love that, both because it's addressing a genuine public health issue, which is overuse of antibiotics. And also it's a terrific proof of concept that even among experts, if they learn that they're doing something that's kind of out of line with the majority, they start to rethink. They might think, well, the majority is full of nonsense, hooray for me. But often they will think, I might be making a mistake here.
Yeah, the same idea works for opiates. So it's a useful general principle. If people are outliers in some undesirable way, tell them about it. And in some contexts, this wouldn't be one, but in some contexts, you want to just publicize it. So publicizing how much carbon emissions various plants make has proven to be a very successful step. But why don't I nudge you, Julia, to let the audience
Thank you both for that. All right. Thank you for the nudge. Very helpful. We will bring in some of these great audience questions. Here's a nice one that you address in one of the first chapters of the book about biases. So an anonymous attendee writes that traditional economics take human preferences as given and behavioral economics take human biases as given. How important do you think it is to locate the underlying source of these preferences and biases? And does this insight contribute a useful dimension to your discussions in Nudge?
You know, the idea that people aren't perfectly rational is not a new one. In fact, it was relatively recent that economists got attached to this wacky idea. The real breakthrough came from our friends, our very good friend to both of us, Danny Kahneman, and his collaborator, Emma Tversky, who had the insight that not only are people boundedly rational, as Herb Simon called it, but they make predictable biases. And that was the insight that really got me started as a behavioral economist and got the field started, because economists used to say, well, sure, people make mistakes, but if they're random, they all just average out. So the key insight was, no, they don't average out. If they're present bias, that means that on average, people are paying too much attention to right now and not enough attention to the future. And lo and behold, then we have climate change.
Another few questions from the audience want to talk more about the idea of sludge. So Steve writes, it seems like a significant number of state legislators are in the process of creating sludge in the voting rights area. What can we do to address that? That's a big one.
If only we had a lawyer here.
Okay, well, you can think of the area of poverty policy, where take-up rates for programs that are intended to benefit people are often in the range of 40 to 60%, which, if my arithmetic is right, suggests that 40 to 60% aren't taking up programs that could really help them a lot. Some restrictions on the right to vote, and the questioner is completely right, are sludge, where there's paperwork burdens and administrative requirements that are not a prohibition, but are doing some of the work of a prohibition. What can we do about it? We can explore every one proposed to see if it's adequately justified and what its impact is.
But it's clear that states have shown, I think Oregon just sends everyone a ballot and they vote by mail. That works very well. There's no evidence of fraud. It's clear that we should eventually be voting online. The American Economic Association, in your introduction, you mentioned that I served for a year as the president of that association. We used to vote in elections by mail, and they switched to online balloting. And I don't remember the amount, but I think voting tripled. And it's very secure. They send you an email, you respond. I just voted today, actually, in our annual election for officers. So we're not quite there yet for national elections, but if we can deal with our bank in a secure way, we certainly should be able to deal with voting. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, snail mail works pretty well.
There's a big lesson in what Dick just said and in the question, a general lesson, which is when behavior isn't of the kind that is desirable, let's say, because people are getting sick or they're getting poor, we often think, how do we push them in the direction that would be, we hope, preferable? It's often better to think, why aren't they doing it anyway? Or why aren't they doing it already? And take away the obstacle. So that leads to kind of nudge 101, or nudge what should be on the, the front cover of an essay on nudge, which is make it easy. So when you're not seeing something, it's often because it's hard. And even if it's just a little bit hard, that little bit of difficulty can operate as a huge barrier, because people are busy and they're, preoccupied and they're living their lives. A little bit hard can mean it won't happen.
I took a peek at one point at the questions, and there's one about nudging vaccines. And I actually have a piece that was posted today and will be published in the New York Times on Sunday on this topic. And like climate change, vaccination policy is so important that we have to consider every tool. And countries around the world have decided, rightly or wrongly, that they're not going to use a mandate. So I don't know of a country, there may be one, but I don't know of a country that has said, you must get mandated. But George Washington actually inoculated the troops for smallpox. So there's precedent for this. But if we're not going to do that, what can we do? Well, there were lots of nudges that worked at getting us up to 2/3. But we're getting now to the people that are pretty strongly opposed or very worried or what have you. And it's my opinion that we're going to have to take sterner measures. And they're probably going to come from the private sector. Mm-hmm. And my university, and I think Cass's, is requiring students to be vaccinated to come back in the fall, and employees. That's a mandate. I think it's justified. Of course, there will be exceptions for medical or religious reasons. I think there are useful lessons from the National Football League, of all places, where a lot of the players were very reluctant to be vaccinated. And the league has said, fine, if you don't want to be vaccinated, you're going to be tested every day. And when you travel to an away game, you have to stay in your room. And if you get a positive test, you're going to be quarantined for 10 days. Whereas if you're vaccinated, it may well be a false positive, and a test the next day, if it's a negative, okay, you're back playing. Well, a series of these rules has gotten the league up to 90% with at least one shot. And they've gotten up there within the last month, mostly, and are trending further up. And there's one company that has announced a very generous policy, big bonuses, $1,500 or maybe $3,000, depending on how many people get vaccinated at a particular work site. And what the NFL and this company are using is group peer pressure. So teammates at the NFL, I've been told that if a star player on the team says he's vaccinated, people start to fall in line. And it's a team thing, because if you get sick and you can't play in a game, we could lose the game. And the same is true if people at our work site aren't being vaccinated, we could all get sick. So I think we're going to have to all look at what we can do. And I think it's essential that we think of some technology that is more advanced than that piece of paper that we get when we're vaccinated. This is, I don't know, first century technology when, a scroll and feather, it's ridiculous. So most sensible countries around the world are giving people a digital record of their vaccination, which allows you to scan it and get through the airport. The Chicago hosted a big rock concert that Cass once went to with his daughter, Lollapalooza. This last week, there were 600,000 people there. They were requiring vaccinations, but people were selling fake vaccine cards at the door. So we need to enter at least the 20th century for our vaccination records, and maybe even the 21st century, given the vaccines were created with very modern technology. I think it's time for our records to also be in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That's so very meaningful. And talking about sort of the people who are going to do the work to eliminate sludge, there certainly seems to be a large need to integrate some of those paper systems with the digital age, which you talk about in the final edition of this book in updating things and keeping us where we are now in 2021. As our final question this evening, before we go to closing thoughts, who do you see as the primary reader of this book? And are there any groups in particular that you hope will read Nudge, the final edition?
You know, when we wrote the first book, I told Cass I'd like to have a specific reader in mind. When I was writing an academic article, I'd think of usually the person who I would think would hate this article the most. And I would write it for that person, just so it would answer at least their first three objections. But for this book, we played around and we ended up with, okay, we're going to write this with two readers in mind. One was our then colleague at the law school, a guy who later became president and was a colleague of Cass's. We thought, oh, it would be nice if our new senator read this book. And the other was David Brooks, the formerly conservative New York Times columnist. I don't know whether he still qualifies as a conservative, but the idea of having Obama and Brooks as our readers was we wanted to span the political spectrum because we were trying to write a book for the middle. But I don't think the book is written for policymakers, although policymakers have taken a great interest in it. As you say, you read it during the pandemic. We've tried, especially this edition, to make it accessible to anybody. And anyone who's interested in humans and dealing better in the world, I think I can modestly say that the book isn't painful to read. It may even be fun. And I think pretty much anyone could read it and get something out of it. And so far, 2 million people have plunked down money to read the old one, and I think this one is better.
Cass, do you agree?
Well, I do. I think anyone who's interested in better choices for themselves or for others, I think one of the things we both feel is that human imperfections are lovable and funny. And one of the joys of writing the book is identifying them and recognizing them in ourselves, that the mistakes that we draw attention to, we are very much prone to. And that sense of recognition, I hope readers will have and make them maybe forgive themselves a little bit better and maybe make a better choice tomorrow.
You know, I think you were going for final thoughts, and let me riff on that as my final thought, which is people often accuse us of thinking we are smarter than anyone else and that we want to run the world and nudge people to agree with us, which is kind of preposterous because we're about as different as people can be. I'm a big wine lover, and Cass limits himself to Diet Coke, maybe occasional with coffee. And so we don't think people are dumb. We think the world is hard. And we're both lovers of GPS because we have a terrible sense of direction. We both get lost if we don't have our wives with us. And we get lost less now that we have Google Maps on our phone. And we imagine a world that's as easy to navigate as walking around is if you have GPS on your phone.
A world in which we are all working together and accepting that we are all humans and not econs, of course. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, thank you so much. Thank our audience out there for tuning into this incredible discussion. Your patronage and dedication enable us to bring you this programming, and we couldn't do it without the book sales to support it. So make sure you follow your link in the chat to purchase your copy of Nudge, the final edition, or you can just visit us at politics-prose.com. And while you're there, feel free to check out the rest of our events calendar for what's coming up in the fall. And from our shelves to yours, we hope everyone out there is staying strong, staying safe, and of course, staying well read. And we will see you next time. Cass and Richard, thank you so much once more.
Well,
Thank you.
Have
And
a
if you live in Washington, go to